Good morning. Welcome to this session of the 2025 Northwest Interlibrary Loan and Resource Sharing Conference. Today's date is September 9th, 2025. This session is titled In It Together, Libraries, AI, and the Power of Collaboration, and will be presented by Nick Tanzi, Assistant Director of the South Huntington Public Library and a Library Technology Consultant. My name is Melissa Perez, and I am convener for this session. Please let us know if you can't hear or can't see the shared screen. This session is being recorded with permission from the presenter. We plan to make these recordings available once the captions have been added. Expect an email from Whova when the recordings have been posted about 3 weeks after the conference. We will take questions at the end of the session from the room and from virtual attendees on Whova. Our virtual colleagues should pose questions on the Whova question and answer app. And don't forget to upvote your favorites. After the session, please complete the survey to enter our prize drawing, which is open to all attendees. If anyone in the room is logged into Whova, please remember not to start this presentation on your device. And now I will turn the session over to our presenter.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I hope everybody's day is going well. Right now I'm in New York. It's 1 o'clock. It's sunny, but a little cool. So I hope your weather's well. Now, artificial intelligence is always a tricky topic to talk about, in part because it's a fairly, at least when we look at generative AI, it's kind of a new technology for many of us. And we're not all in the same place with it. We have varied feelings, some positive, some negative, some conflicted. I'm one of those people that's a bit conflicted. And this is a conference that's about collaboration, is about resource sharing, and it's a little tricky to do that when we're all kind of headed in different directions or maybe don't have, or not of one mind on these things. But I want to talk about ways that we can collaborate and where even those differences of opinions actually, I think, aid us as we look to collaborate and engage with an emerging technology that has real friction with the librarianship. So just really quickly, a little bit about me. I'm bringing a public library perspective, and I always like to say it's a public library perspective. It's not the public library perspective. Nobody elected me president of anything. I don't speak for the librarianship, but I have experiences that are informed by a number of years in libraries and the mistakes I've made and the good things I've done. But it is a public library perspective. And I like to remind people that while I am a technology consultant, I'm a tech-focused librarian, I'm not necessarily a techie. I was a history major. I kind of stumbled into the librarianship, and I actually started in youth services, but then I was offered a position. I think there was an assumption because I was young, I was a techie. That wasn't really true. But it came with a raise. So I said, heck yeah, I'm a techie and I can do all that stuff. And then I had to learn very quickly. And in truth, that was the best training because that is the nature of the job, is constantly learning something new, is evolving, is, adapting, because technology always changes. So I've done quite a bit of writing, quite a bit of blogging. I maintain a website, thedigitallibrarian.com, that's hyphenated. Where I kind of share my thoughts on the intersection of libraries and technology. And then because we have complicated feelings about AI, I think it's always important to understand at least what my perspective is, because inevitably I am going to filter information based on those biases I have, those opinions I have. And I always tell people to seek out lots of opinions on this technology. But my I guess, underlying feeling about AI is that it's not going anywhere. I am not somebody that believes the genie can be put back in the bottle. So a lot of my time and attention is kind of focused on, what is the appropriate relationship with the technology? How do we work within an AI world? But I do understand that some people feel like, you can make it go away. I don't, but I'm also not a techno optimist. And so I'll talk about those real harms, those ethical frictions, but also the utility of the technology today. Now, in terms of this rapidly advancing emerging technology that is generative AI, I would say this didn't come at a great time for libraries. I would say that we have a lot on our plates right now. Typically, when something is a once in a century event, it's not supposed to happen 2 times in 5 years. We had a global pandemic that really, I want to talk about disruption. That was very disruptive to society at large, but also the library's business model. And even as we were talking about navigating that new normal, then what happens? Then somebody sounds a trumpet and tells you you've entered the age of AI and everything's going to change again. We have to reimagine how we do business. And that can be a source of frustration. Change is never fun, especially when you didn't ask for it. And coming on the heels of another transformative event, again, the pandemic, that's a lot to take in. It's also happening at a time when libraries are under attack. Censorship is on the rise, academic freedom is under attack. There's certainly a lot of uncertainty when it comes to funding, the status of IMLS. There's economic uncertainty, which is always an interesting time for libraries because we know that, and again, this is a public library perspective, but when the economy is uncertain, when people feel it in their pocketbooks, our funding becomes uncertain, but also our usage just tends to go up. So we need it more than ever, but people have less of an ability to pay. There has been a growth in e-content in libraries, and I feel like we're approaching a tipping point where it's increasingly becoming, difficult to float print and digital. That digital is costing more and more, and there's questions about how economically sustainable the model is. If anybody's drowning in money, raise your hand, and I'll be happy to help you with that problem. But I feel like we're all struggling with our growing digital collections and how do we continue to pay for them? They're needed, they're wanted. The more money we feed into them, the more those collections take off, but there is a tipping point. My own library, we're about 50-50 now in terms of circulation, digital and print. And we're starting to feel that strain. And we're in a period of accelerating technological change. A lot of that is AI driven. There are times when things speed up. The advent of the internet, the World Wide Web in 1993, things went pretty quick. Mobile devices, 2007, 2009, 2009, the iPhone, and how quickly mobile devices took off. And so now here we are grappling with generative AI that challenges us in many different ways. Now, I feel like AI has some very unique challenges, some of which are just broad challenges, and some of them are library specific. Broadly speaking, generative AI is tricky because of the speed that this technology is advancing. There's not a lot of roadblocks. We're in a period of time when it feels like a gold rush, when we're in a hype cycle. And every day there's a new tool, right? And actually more than one, there's probably a dozen or 2 dozen new tools at different platforms. And there's a certain amount of churn that's happening with the rise and fall of companies and, trying to keep an eye on trends and what it means for copyright. So there's this rapid acceleration. Every day something new is happening. And how do you keep up, right? Because we're in this weird position where we're trying to both learn and teach at the same time, and that's never a fun place to be. Another challenge is the omnipresence of AI. I am so used to, as a library, dealing with digital equity issues where there are haves and have-nots, where people don't have access, and that is the problem I'm trying to solve. Right now, I feel like many of our libraries are encountering the problem of everybody has access, or a lot of people have access, but not necessarily the underlying understanding. When we talk about the omnipresence of generative AI, if you're using a desktop computer, Copilot is being built into the Windows operating system. If you're using a mobile device, Gemini is being built into Android devices, and Apple Intelligence is being built into Apple. So that's 99% of the mobile market. If you're using social media, Meta AI is basically everywhere. If you're using Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, any of these platforms. So access is there. And then if you're using the internet just at large, even if you yourself are not actively using AI, you are likely exposed to the outputs of generative AI. You know that if you run a Google search, you're getting the experimental Google results. That's a challenge. You have a new, unfamiliar technology that's everywhere, seemingly unavoidable. And AI, and the thing I worry about sometimes the most, is what it's doing to our information space. One of the challenges is it is a misinformation machine and can be a disinformation machine. It's increased the quantity of information, but not necessarily the quality. You hear about AI slop, low quality content that's AI generated. Those are broad challenges. When I look library specific, what are we facing? Well, we're facing a lot of ethical friction. If you feel a bit icky about AI as a librarian, that immune response is actually probably a good thing because there are issues with algorithmic bias with this technology. There is an environmental impact, and as of 2019, sustainability is a core value of the librarianship. And artificial intelligence, generative AI, has a growing carbon footprint. It can be an energy-intensive process. It requires large data centers, and those data centers require cooling, which has a high water usage. So there are very real frictions there. Libraries are predicated on privacy, privacy that aids freedom of inquiry, right? Nobody's looking over your shoulder. Privacy, your patron records are sacrosanct. But when you use generative AI, those human interactions are data, and they go back into the system. So those are real frictions, and those are library-specific frictions. Then there's the sense that generative AI is a white-collar threat. I think previous incarnations of kind of automation and technological advancement, they tend to be blue-collar threats. And this time around, it's a white-collar threat. So I think it feels more personal because it is more personal. This feels like stuff that's coming after our jobs when we think about agentic AI, for example. And then finally, I talked about broad challenges, the information landscape, the pollution of that information landscape, and our collections are not immune from this. There is an increasing prevalence of AI slop. In particular, it's making its way into our digital collections. Part of that is we don't have the same acquisition standards necessarily. Sometimes we're buying access to a collection rather than individually curating that collection. And that is where we're seeing more and more kind of low quality AI generated materials. Sometimes they're summations of popular books. Sometimes they're like mockbusters that are meant to, I remember going to Blockbuster and there was Jurassic Park and then there was Cretaceous Park, the $100 budget knockoff. You're seeing the AI generated book equivalents of these things popping up. And that should concern us because our sources are precious. And once you lose the quality of those sources, once you lose the trust of your users, what do you have left? So those are lots of challenges. Now, how do we actually overcome these challenges? Well, as our conference theme is very much focused on resource sharing. We do this by working together through collaboration. And I've been itching to use this meme for a long time, so I was so happy to have an opportunity. So thank you to the committee. But this is something that requires collective action, I think, in order to be most successful as we navigate the change brought on by AI. And I want to look at this in several different facets, how we can work collaboratively, starting with staff training. And I think all of us kind of instinctually know that staff training is often the solution to the problem. But it's easy to say, we need to train everybody, we need to engage in training. Yeah, of course. But we know that staff training is difficult. It's not easy. It is one of the more labor-intensive things we do. I know that when I hire somebody new, for example, it's actually a net loss at the start, and it's not an indictment of that person. They can be wonderful, but so much of your attention goes from doing your job to helping somebody learn their job that, it distracts. It can be a loss. Eventually, it pays off. So staff training, obvious answer, always tricky because it is time intensive, it's time consuming. And when we look at AI, there's such a speed of change that I know that sometimes people can say, how do I even approach this when what is true today is not necessarily true tomorrow? And that's where resource sharing is going to be very important. I want to give a couple case studies, which were collaborative approaches at different scales that attempted to deal with generative AI from a training perspective. This first one is a case study. New York State had a youth services AI challenge. This was created by the Youth Services Consultants of New York State. New York actually has 23 public library systems. And, I do a lot of travel. I go to a lot of different states. And I always have this game I play where I have an imaginary vision of what a state is and what it's like. And then you actually go there, and it tends to be very different than your imagination. And for folks that haven't been to New York or have only been to parts of New York, sometimes you think of New York and you think of it as New York City. But New York is a huge state, and there's a lot of disparity socioeconomically. It is a large state. There are entire stretches of that state that are quite rural. There are sections of the state when we look at libraries that are resource rich, that are well funded. And then there are areas where the only paid employee of a library is its director, and they have very limited hours. So for us, we look at New York State, we knew there was a training need that exists, but it's challenging geographically, and the fact that there's this wide disparity in library sizes, funding, staffing levels, all of these things. The youth services coordinators within our state were, actually, let me go one more slide. They built this challenge, which was web-based. It was actually took place over Padlet. It was a 6-week challenge, and it was performed asynchronously. So each week, anybody who signed up would receive an email. That email would have a challenge. And challenges were typically focused on things like prompt engineering or specific tool and platform or different use cases. They gave you try to do a brainstorming exercise, for example, or focused on social media marketing. And again, this was tied towards youth services librarians. You would then interact with the challenge, you would post it on Padlet directly, and then your colleagues and also the instructors themselves would supply feedback. So when we talk about collaborative, it was everybody giving these technologies, these tools, these platforms a different look, giving their opinion, sharing their experience, interacting with others, and then using that hive mind to quickly digest a bunch of different tools and to share those very different perspectives. Because what worked for one library maybe doesn't work for another. Or when we talk about some of the ethical frictions, the concerns, people could share those concerns more widely with others. Signing up for this wasn't predicated on liking the technology, although in this instance, this training was very focused on safe experimentation, on tool use. So it was focused on usage and on both experimentation and then kind of really putting these things to work. Because it was more focused on the utility, we know that there would be gaps in this training. My own participation in this was I was asked at the end of the 6 weeks to then provide a talk. And so my talk was meant to kind of hit the spots where maybe the training didn't, because it was so focused on utility. So my own talk then was focused on the impact of generative AI on youth. What are the risks? What are we seeing? What is the early data on how children and teens are interacting with this technology? Because you never want to engage in scaremongering, and you never want to engage in simply boosterism. Those two things have to meet in the middle, and people need to have more of an awareness. So I felt like that kind of was a good bookend for the training. You can see here, this is simply a screenshot. There is an archived version of the training itself. And I do link out to it. So when I share the slides, you'll be able to follow that hyperlink on the bottom to view the training, or of course you can Google it. It was called the AI Youth Services Challenge. And on each of these challenges, each of these columns now, they are archived, but you can actually scroll through and see people's contributions to it, how they engaged with the different challenges, the comments, the discourse that went on. But when we look at New York State, which is a large state, it's very difficult to train. Asynchronous, I think, worked really well for us. When we talk about how can we share that hive mind, this type of platform where everybody could comment on everybody else's stuff, I think really aided that type of endeavor. Now going a little more narrow. Sometimes the collaboration I think that needs to happen when we break down the silos within our own library. Sometimes it feels like we're running multiple libraries out of one organization. Departments don't always talk, they don't always share ideas. This was one we specifically did at my own library, the South Huntington Public Library. We started an AI user group. It was almost like a pre-training. It's not taking the place of formal training, but there was so much discourse. We definitely had the sense that staff was using artificial intelligence without any guidance from administration. So we wanted to really quickly take the temperature of the room. My own library, we have 68 employees. Not everybody, that's pages, librarians, custodians, library clerks, administration. And so we did an open invite. And again, participant in this wasn't predicated in, calling all of generative AI. It was interested, concerned, wanted a voice, was invited. You know that in-person meetings can be quite difficult. So I showed present from circulation, from our business office, from administration, team, from adult service. So pretty rapidly, we wanted to hit the different kind of topics, large language models, conversational search, generative AI broadly, but things like text to image, the suite of workspace software. We are in a Google environment in my library, so Gemini was a natural product to look at. And how this actually ran. See, I said weekly, and then I adjusted to biweekly. A weekly was aspirational goal. But each week or every other week, we would explore a new tool. So we would take something like, I believe ChatGPT was the first one we started with. We described what it was, how it worked, some best practices. For example, if I'm prompting with ChatGPT, what does that look like? We would take a question and answers, a session from staff, and then we would assign homework. And that homework needed to be broad enough based so that it was relevant to everybody. So something like ChatGPT, I would say, try to use ChatGPT to brainstorm a solution to a problem you're having, right? That's open enough. Or try to use Gemini to help you draft a staff memo. That's something that was relevant to my custodians, to my librarians, to my maintenance team, to IT, to everybody. And I will point out that who ran the sessions changed because some of us already had familiarity with different tools. And so those folks who are more power users of certain tools tended to take the lead on instruction for those. Then we would meet back and we would share feedback. We would talk about the thing that we were assigned, how it went, did it go well, did it do well, what were your questions, what were your concerns? And actually, sometimes we would have, for example, ChatGPT, when we used it, you needed to have an account. And we had a few staff members that were like, it needs my phone number to use this. Absolutely not. And that was educational for folks. The fact that they understood that there was a trade-off that they were sacrificing privacy when you use a software like this is instructional, and I think was important. Now, our goals for this type of collaborative training, well, short term, we wanted to demystify AI for staff. Just having them understand that it's math, it's not magic, that it can make mistakes, what it actually is. Sometimes we have magical thinking about what AI is. It also, and I'm now speaking as administration a bit here, but it allowed me to run a stress test for existing policy. Sometimes we would meet back and the feedback would be like, hey, this might put stress on this particular policy, or hey, we could really use an AI tool use policy. That's good feedback to have. It allowed us to determine appropriate tools and use cases. We started to find out what is it good at, what isn't it good at, what should we avoid. More medium term, it aided us in future policy development. We could start to figure out the policy solutions to regulate what is an unregulated technology, at least within our walls. I talk about this as pre-training. This is not a replacement for, for formal training, but where it's particularly useful is I had folks from all different departments that went to this and started to understand how it might be applied in their particular situation. So when we go to devise training, we can have these folks help us make relevant training, relevant to their position, to their department, rather than an organization-wide one-size-fits-all, because there's nothing worse than going to training that's not relevant, right? And then we wanted staff to be fluent in AI so that we could become the AI navigator, so that when people ask us, our patrons, our users, community partners for guidance, we could speak a little more authoritatively about this technology. Our keys in both these instances, both in the statewide and our own SHPL training, South Huntington Public Library training, was to make sure that the training was collaborative, that everybody felt like they were in the driver's seat, that they were working together, that it wasn't top down, that it was inclusive, that it wasn't predicated on I'm a fan of AI, that you could be a critic, that you could have concerns and come to this training, that it was flexible as much as possible. Even with the homework assignments, if you missed a week in the in-person training, we could catch you up pretty quickly. And you could work on the balance of the project on your own time. In the other asynchronous model, statewide, you could see how that flexibility was really helpful. And then finally, that it was relevant. As we talk about collaboratively figuring out generative AI, policy is going to be extremely important. We are in a deregulatory environment. There are less guardrails governing AI than almost anything, and what little remains seems to be under stress. We're kind of full speed ahead as a society right now on this technology, and we know that's kind of a problem. Very powerful, unregulated technology usually doesn't have a lot of happy endings, although it can make some awesome science fiction novels. If we're being honest, and you can all nod your heads, we're all policy pirates. Before we write a new policy, we typically consult other people's policies, right? It's kind of borrowing without asking. Where sometimes you reach out and you say, hey, I might take this. Because we see value in our colleagues, their work, trying to figure out, appropriate, relevant policy. And so that is where collaboration, I think, is really important when we look at generative AI. All of us are kind of hanging back. Nobody wants to be first to the party. It's really tough being first. We tend to be really good on building on what others have built, on having frameworks. And early in our relationship with generative AI, there's not a lot of that. We all feel like we're waiting for somebody else to go first. And rather than have that stress, why not spread that stress out and work on policy collaboratively? Um, Oftentimes, our policies come from a particular experience that led us to making a policy. Anybody ever have that? Really, policy is predicated on like something bad happened, and you want to avoid that happening again. Um, when we get together as organizations to try to figure out policy, we are able to bring those anecdotes with us so that rather than have to wait until you experience like a very stressful day on when generative AI breaks a policy or necessitates a policy, it's really great to talk about the ways that the stuff is stressing us. Some of the early conversations I was having a few years ago was, AI slop making its way into collections and the need to address that from a policy standpoint. So when we all get together, we can see some of those stress points and start figuring out policy solutions, uh, you know, more effectively. AI also requires that we take a big tent approach when we do policy, and because emerging technologies tend to be unfair. They affect and impact everybody differently. The stakes are different for different people. And being able to get broad perspectives from people position us to better address the technology from a policy standpoint. As we said, guardrails. Now, we're not all cookie cutter, but consistency, policy consistency can aid us, especially as we work with vendors. So we don't seem like no one of us seems like a weirdo that we have a particular AI policy. The more consistency that's there, the more there's an expectation from library users who visit other libraries, but also library vendors who try to sell us products. In particular, I imagine many of us have digital collections that are interconnected, that are consortium purchases, where we work collaboratively to build these things to scale, right? Um, when I look around the country, I'm from Suffolk County. We have library, which is many, many millions of dollars worth of e-content that we bought all together. And we have 53 libraries that each have different collection development policies because we're each standalone libraries. And that dichotomy is kind of a weird one. And we may likely need to address that, AI stress on our digital collection in a way that's collaborative. So if e-content is a significant expenditure, if we've bought this thing collaboratively, we likely need things like collection development policies that are collaborative in approach. I talk about AI slop, and this is a real stress right now. There is a real quality control issue. Amazon was being the biggest book vendor, right? They experienced AI slop quite acutely a number of years ago. They had to pull a bunch of books that were like a field guide to mushrooms from their collection because they had bad information. They told you could tell a mushroom's toxicity by its smell. That's not true. If you smell a bunch of mushrooms, guess what? They all kind of smell like dirt. That's not a great indicator of whether it's safe to eat. And I talk about the stakes being different. The same is true of information. If I get a book that's poorly written by generative AI, but it's just a bad fantasy novel, okay, I've wasted my time. I may have wasted some money. If I get bad information about what mushrooms are safe to eat, that could have life-altering consequences, right? So we recognize that there is, a kind of a wide disparity in consequences here. 404 Media, I definitely recommend folks look for the expose they've done about AI-generated slop in public libraries. In particular, they looked at Hoopla, for example. But again, low-quality content that is costing us money from an acquisition standpoint on a per-circ basis. That also has the net effect of hiding good materials. And then we have human-authored books that have AI narration. And that's a mixed bag, but certainly there should be disclosure there. Robin Bradford is a librarian who contributed to a piece on, it's a blog, it's called Smart Bitches Trashy Books. It looks in particular at romance novels. they did a great expose on audiobooks and AI generated audiobooks in libraries, and kind of bemoaned the lack of collection development policy in libraries governing generative AI. So I'm not trying to stress anybody out, but when we talk about why should we deal with policy collaboratively, well, in part because so much of our digital collections, I think, are built collaboratively. And so the answer has to be dealt with, I think, with all hands on deck. Now I want to talk a little bit about library osmosis. We all share, we all learn from each other. When you think about the schools and how they're impacted by generative AI, there is a lot of focus on things like academic honesty. The fact that AI is a very attractive, easy button. ChatGPT is a very attractive, easy button for doing homework, for doing book reports. Educators are trying to imagine how do they assess at this point. How do you tell if something is AI authored or not? What is the appropriate relationship between scholarship and generative AI? And this is really an environment of uncertainty. There's a bunch of good early scholarship here. Common Sense Education has a nice piece that looked at generative AI usage among children and teens. And right now, there is a lot of or a lack of awareness about what is appropriate. 60% of teens in that survey report that either their school has no rules for how generative AI is supposed to be used or not, or if there are rules, they're unaware. Parents, in a similar fashion, said they're not aware of their school's generative AI policy. So there's a lot of questions about what's acceptable use. Why do I bring this up? Well, in my public library, I get students all the time, and they're looking for help. And they may be looking to use these tools or in scholarly pursuits, and I don't know what the school statement is. I don't know what the school media librarian, a school media specialist is telling them is appropriate. I don't know their curriculum. And the last thing I want to do is help a student, but put them down a path that gets them in trouble, right? So there are a lot of conversations that have to happen between professionals here, across disciplines, across the librarianship. School media specialists need to connect with their public librarian counterparts and vice versa. We need to have these open lines of communication. If you have local colleges and universities, do they have an aid statement, AI disclosure statement? What are they telling folks about what is appropriate use? Because again, it's not uncommon to be helping college students, especially when we subscribe to a database, maybe their school doesn't, and they may be using generative AI and not be aware of what's appropriate or not, or what is appropriate in terms of citation, disclosure. So very important to open those lines of communication. Later on, I'll talk how expertise across disciplines, across library types is also very important to share. Because absent this type of collaboration, these open lines of communication, mistakes are going to be made. You're going to make a good faith effort to help a student, and they may be using a widely available technology in a way that gets them in trouble. And I don't want to make that kind of mistake. Now, there's an expertise gap, right? We're all experiencing generative AI in real time. This is a crash course. You're trying to teach and learn at the same time. And this is a broad statement, and anytime you're making generalizations, this is always dangerous area. But I would say that there are points of emphasis between different library types, your academic, your public, your school libraries. And certainly there are different audiences, right? We're used to serving different audiences. When I look at the public library, I look at us as experts in digital equity, in helping the have-nots, right? And giving the access. And in particular, public libraries are positioned to bridge the gap between formal education. Think about the internet, 1993. Very quickly, libraries had to figure out the World Wide Web to provide access, to provide training. Folks that came afterwards, it was part of their school's curriculum, right? It was part of the university curriculum, but there were always that group of people who were caught in the lurch. And the public library is positioned to help those folks who don't get that formal education, that don't have the advantage of going through K through 12 with this technology, or into colleges and universities. Within our academic libraries, they're doing a lot of the early work on the relationship between generative AI and research, on information literacy, on workforce preparedness. Um, and then in schools, there's a focus on media literacy, on critical thinking in the age of AI. And so all of us in the different facets of librarianship have an opportunity to share that expertise with our peers of the different groups that we specialize in working with and the different aspects of access and understanding that we play. That's super important. I also like to think about, the pandemic was so instructive in many ways. When we talk about disruption and digital equity, I think it was a crash course for politicians in the idea that like not everybody has access to the internet. um, and within our school district, we had a lot of folks who were suddenly given a Chromebook, and that's how they went to school for a number of months. And we discovered that, in particular, the parents and especially our Spanish speaking community didn't have the resources, didn't have the understanding on how to get into Google Classroom, on how to use the underlying device. So that was a good bridge for us to fill in the gap with digital equity and teach people in a way that was collaborative with the school district. So as we're trying to all figure out what are we going to do about generative AI and all the different ways it stresses us, we need to look for those places where we can collaborate because it impacts all of us. Now, same way there's a lack of kind of a policy, there's a lack of frameworks, but we're beginning to see the rise of different frameworks that can serve as roadmaps. And I, as a public librarian, am especially grateful to our colleagues in academic libraries who have been building a lot of the frameworks on things like AI literacy, um, on assessment tools that I think are super important as we try to figure out this technology. For example, I would like to spotlight the 6 frames for AI literacy. This is Sandy Herbeau and Amanda Wheatley. They're located in Canada. I'm blanking on the college. It'll come to me eventually. But this is a white paper, and I will be providing the slides. I actually have access to the slides, I believe, through the Whova site. These things are hyperlinked. So you can, for example, go to this framework. And this is, in particular, 6 frames for AI literacy, and it's targeted for librarians that are information instructors. So it's meant to kind of give you the frames for teaching others. And like anything, we borrow, we adapt, we see where the stuff makes sense, where it's relevant, where it isn't. And their 6 frames are to know the basic principles of artificial intelligence, to understand the fundamental differences of AI types, to experiment with AI tools, to review the outputs and outcomes of AI tools, to evaluate the impact of AI on a societal scale, and to engage with AI discourse. And I always like to highlight this last point, to engage with AI discourse. It is critical that we stay engaged because what is true today isn't true tomorrow. Platforms change their terms of service in ways that maybe make us like them more or like them less. The regulatory environment, such as it is, may change in ways that are beneficial or not. There's been some real highs and lows with copyright, right? 1 minute Anthropic, is maybe getting away with downloading a bunch of materials and using it to train. Then all of a sudden they're facing a lawsuit. Then they pay a settlement. And then that settlement gets thrown out because it may be not enough. So you need to stay engaged because there is so much churn. There are so many things that are changing. it is essential that we kind of have a sense of, what the latest is and adapt our approach to match. Staying engaged with AI discourse to me also means listening to people that maybe disagree with you. I think that's very important, that you don't fall into just straight AI boosterism, or that you, likewise become a prophet of doom. I think you need to constantly stay engaged with the discourse, especially when you disagree with it. When we talk about assessment, there are different tools that are being built. Again, to spotlight one, this is an ethical AI assessment tool. This comes from Sarah Treibelhorn. She's a sciences and sustainability librarian at San Diego State University. This particular assessment tool provides benchmarks for things like fairness and bias, transparency and explainability, privacy and security, the environmental impact, accountability and oversight, and social impact. So again, I am so grateful to work being done by colleagues that are building the frameworks that I think really help inform the librarianship. Because absent that, it's so hard to, if you're spending all your time doing creation and none of it on curation and none of it on collaboration, if all of us are individually taking on the weight of all of this, that's not a great roadmap. That's not really a recipe for success for any of us. And then finally, we're talking about collaboration. I want to talk about collective power, because often, especially when we're talking about big tech, there is a feeling, a sense of powerlessness. If you ever get locked out of your Facebook account, it's like, how do you get a hold of Mark Zuckerberg? Doesn't seem doesn't seem likely. You feel like you're just screaming into the void. Or when Google, for example, lists the wrong hours for your business. If you don't claim that space, it's really difficult to get that stuff done right. I remember during the pandemic, I finally had to go and claim our Google space in my library because we had been closed, obviously because of COVID, and Google decided to list our business as permanently closed. You do not like to see that. I'd like to correct that. But there is a power disparity, right? When we're talking about big tech, the Anthropics, the open AIs of the world, certainly the Googles and the Microsofts. So how do we preserve library values in an AI world, right? We need to engage with this technology, but it can't come at the cost of library values. Well, when I deal with business, and oftentimes people ask me, like, they want me to make predictions about how a company might act. And it tends to be easier than you think, because what I tell them is expect the company to do everything they can to make a lot of money and do none of the things that cost them money or cut into their profit. And that's not, listen, this is not me just giving a screed on capitalism. Businesses exist to make money. They want to make a lot of money. They have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders. So when we talk about these different platforms, these different tools, the only language that they understand is money. They speak the language of money, of profit and loss, of dollars and cents. And that can be frustrating for us because we're broke, right? We speak in a whisper. We don't have a ton of money. It's tough to throw our weight around when we want, for example, Gemini to be more respectful of somebody's privacy. But we do have a force multiplier, and that's when we work together. We have very little money on our own, but when we start combining, we have more money. And we know this when we look at our digital collections. That's why so many of us did consortium purchases, right? We were able to build mass much quicker by working together than we would if we worked individually. When we talk about policy consistency, that's setting expectations for people that want to do business with the library. And we've seen instances, take Microsoft, for example. I'm not sure if any of you had, LinkedIn for libraries, LinkedIn Learning. You recall they were kind of disrespectful about requiring a public account, public-facing account in order to use it. Libraries were not happy about that. We started backing out our business, and they responded. So yes, individually, we're all broke as libraries. Collectively, we have a little more money. And we have some battlegrounds that are more effective than others. Those, of course, are library vendors. We represent significant source of funding if you're a library specific or at least educational vendor. So those are battlegrounds that we should certainly choose, right? We should be able to impose our will with folks that sell us ebooks and databases. We shouldn't find ourselves compromising in these areas where we can speak with a louder voice and our money does go further. But if we're picked off individually, we're less likely to see positive results. So at this point, I'm happy to take any questions. And right now, just for clarity, I am only in Zoom right now. I'm not in Whova. So however we want to handle both the virtual and the in-person, I'll leave that to the conference organizers. And I imagine you may need a few minutes just to. Let me know too if you need me to jump into Whova, but as of right now, I'm just in the Zoom itself. And I guess in the hybrid room, it is muted.
Hey, Nick, the in-person, they are monitoring Whova and they will be with you in just one moment for questions.
Sounds good. Okay,
All right,
perfect.
thank you.
Thank you.
Can you try
Yeah.
now? Can you try again?
Yes, good.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear
I
me
can
now?
hear you.
Oh,
Okay, good. Now let me see if I remember my question. Thank you, Nick, for your presentation. And so you were talking a lot, some about the AI and how to overcome AI. You mentioned about AI and acceptable use of AI. So here is my question. AI
Sure.
is here to stay. AI is not going to go away like pandemic did.
Mhm.
So maybe instead of thinking of AI, how we can make this thing go away, rather think what would be not only acceptable, but encouraged use of AI.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So yeah, actually, and I'm not sure if you came in a few minutes after, but basically my position on AI is that it is not going anywhere, and that our energy needs to be focused on what is the appropriate relationship with this technology. Now, the body of what I talked about may seem a little antagonistic towards the technology, but it was more focused on proceeding from a place of safety, of caution, right? And I think our priority is making sure that staff, and then by extension, we're able to train our public on being AI literate, on understanding how the technology can be used, the risks of it, the ethics behind it, because all of that, and then the policy building, those are things that are foundational, and that any future adoption of the technology in a more formal sense needs to be predicated on effective policy, on staff that are trained, on transparency, on those things. But absolutely, this is a technology that, yeah, I find plenty of utility with, and in part is why we are prioritizing the development of staff AI tool use policy, because, yeah, we have staff that use it, myself included, as a productivity tool, as a brainstorming tool. But there's so much that needs to come first. And we need to have these conversations with staff who have a wide range of feelings and comfort with the technology. So thank you for your question. But yeah, no, certainly I don't believe that AI is going anywhere. I think it's going to change, and some of that change may be technology driven. It may be regulatory environment.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much. It's been incredibly informative and very helpful. One thing that I'm curious about, if you have any insight on, I think a lot of us are used to the hesitation with AI and the careful kind of caution when we approach it. Very recently at my library, we are kind of encountering an issue where some departments are maybe not so cautious, and that's something that we're trying to I guess, communicate in a way, but it's difficult when it comes to departments that are focused on security. So, for example, campus safety, we are currently in discussions about including something of a panic button for our student employees. And they want to include cameras with that. And with that kind of technology, there are so many privacy issues that we're concerned about as librarians, which really reminds me of your when you mentioned library values and not overstepping those boundaries. And there's been kind of I don't know, we were kind of bringing up our concerns, and one of our representatives from campus safety just looked at us and said, cameras protect people. And there's just this kind of, well, I don't know how much we can talk to you about this, especially with the idea of feeding any kind of information to ICE if they were asked for that recorded video that's being taken all the time. We have many concerns, and it's hard to communicate with somebody who's not quite willing to bridge that.
So one of the things that we all encounter, if you work with the public, you know that everybody has a wide variety of ideas about what is responsible behavior. We all consider ourselves responsible. New technologies, emerging technologies, tend to stress us in different ways. And what I always say is, partly we're prioritizing things like a tool use policy to try to add some safeguards. And what we often have to do is sometimes it means having new policies, sometimes it means viewing a new technology through an existing policy lens. So you have concerns about privacy, and we need to see what types of policy do you already have on things like data privacy, on user privacy, and are there conflicts? Separately, security cameras are a version of surveillance technology, and the stakes have changed. What it takes to make a deep fake of me, listen, I'm doing a YouTube video, you have enough. My privacy is more precious than ever, and the stakes for losing it are higher. So, you have some people who maybe have won this argument about security cameras some years ago, but the ground has changed under our feet, and it's time to have new conversations about what that means. So that's the first thing I would do is look at your existing policy and see what it says about this new technology or doesn't say. And then see if there are deficits that need to be addressed with policy. And again, that's partially why I encourage these wide conversations because, you know, I don't think that security isn't well-meaning, but there are conflicts here and there are different stakes and different perspectives, and they need to air those things out.
We do have some online ones.
Sure.
In your AI user group, how did your staff address the tension between libraries valuing copyright compliance versus LLMs feeding their models stolen materials at worst, or using work without the permission of the creator at best?
Yeah, so right now, the copyright situation is unclear. And one of the things when we talk about engagement with the discourse is I think there is a bit of a separation. What I mean by that, let me explain. The Association of College and Research Libraries, the American Library Association combined to form the Library Copyright Alliance. And when they talk about copyright, right now, they say that that ingestion, where you're gobbling up stuff that oftentimes is copyrighted and oftentimes is not with the creator's permission, is fair use. And they've written, you know, letters in support of that. But then the output, what you create, may be a copyright violation. That's not me agreeing or disagreeing. I have very weird feelings about this. But it is that there is a bit of a divide between what our professional organizations may be saying about this and what we think they're saying about this. So the copyright situation is unclear. When we talk about something like ChatGPT in the context of that user group, we talk about what it does and how it gets that stuff and where that comes from. And people have a certain comfort or discomfort with that. And our professional ethics, this is where it's muddy, say that we balance the rights between rights holders and fair use and copyright when these things are still unclear. So the honest answer is we can communicate that it's unclear at this time. We're seeing things with Anthropic, but Anthropic, for example, they're getting in trouble for gobbling up lots of stuff, but mainly it was their method that they did it, that they pirated a bunch of materials. So yeah, that tends to be what we do is tell people where it all came from, you know, how it was built, provide them the information to make an informed choice so they're clear on where that came from. But for me to tell them you're violating copyright would be untrue at this time, right?
I have another one.
Sure.
Thank you. Is there anything you feel is missing from the frameworks you mentioned? Something else you'd like to see emphasized?
Yeah, so when I tell you to read critical pieces, I am going to direct you to one that I found particularly impactful. This was a recent piece it's a website. It's called In the Library with the Lead Pipe. The author is Baer, B-A-E-R. I imagine that's enough information for information professionals to find the particular article on generative AI. But they had a critique that stuck with me about AI literacy, that we tend to offer up AI literacy as the solution, right? But that the way these AI literacy frameworks or curriculum are built are predicated on the idea that you will adopt this technology. And I think that is a fair and good criticism that it almost feels like you're cooking the books, right? That this ends with you then using the technology rather than assessing whether that technology is appropriate, both for you and your organization.
I have some more online ones, but I guess in person. Anyone in person?
In your
Well, reliable is a loaded word. And, part of the problem is it depends on the task, right? Like, I'm somebody who uses ChatGPT quite a bit for brainstorming. And honestly, for even helping with rephrasing a sentence. I'm also in a Google Workspace environment. So Gemini is very helpful for summations of things that are not, that don't include personally identifiable information, for example. So it's a combination of it being like present in my day-to-day and also the tasks I'm putting it to. I tend to not ever use generative AI like as a research tool. It just isn't. I was always a Google Power user, and it's really kind of ruined Google's first page results for me.
Sorry. Yeah.
So yeah, and that's where a lot of when we talk about collaborative training and putting our minds together is folks discovering where there is utility and where it is, certain tools and platforms are the wrong tool or platform for the job. But again, brainstorming, rephrasing sentences, especially when I'm trying to write a good headline for copy, I found ChatGPT to be very effective for that. And I tend to use it and I encourage you to use these tools as not a replacement for expertise, but as an augmentation for expertise. And so when I'm rephrasing something, I feel like I'm in the driver's seat because I know what I'm trying to say. I'm putting my words in there and I know if it's my voice or not.
How do you square AI training with the ethical and environmental concerns, especially among staff who may not want to engage directly with AI due to these issues? Does the harm
Yeah.
reduction of information professionals being able to teach others outweigh these concerns in using AI for AI training?
It's a great question, and it really is an ethical quandary because there's a bit of circular logic for myself anyways, which is part of a complete AI training has to focus on ethics and how you square the ethics with the librarianship. And if that requires our usage of something you find potentially problematic, where does that leave you? And then I feel like we have a responsibility to our users to help them navigate and that we're better positioned to do that if we're practitioners. So it's really, really tricky. I don't have an easy answer for you other than to say, if your training isn't talking about the ethics, that's incomplete. I also feel like, though, if the training I'm giving people is simply to ignore that there's any utility to the technology, that's factually biased information as well. And I have to try to square those two things. I know that's not much of an answer. That's a lot of hand-wringing. But that is one of those things I struggle with. And again, I have the name of the article too, which is, I said I had it and now I don't have it. It's investigating the feeling rules of generative AI. That is one that talks about the issue with AI instruction that's seemingly predicated on the adoption of the technology.
What neat discoveries or ways of doing things did you folks discover when you all used AI to problem solve at your library network?
I think folks have found a lot of utility in it as a brainstorming tool. I mentioned the folks that did not like that they had to register for these products. And I think that when you discover even an ick moment, that is real discovery that is important. When you discover the friction or how the sausage is made, that's important. Because I think we owe it to everybody to be in a position to make informed decisions about an emerging technology. I found folks that really appreciate its ability for summation, for taking a lot of information and making some bullet points, or doing the opposite, being able to take a few core ideas and then expound it into something a little bit bigger. My folks who write a lot of copy for the newsletter that typically have a space requirement, anytime they can get a more concise version of something can be incredibly useful. And then some of my instructors who have different audiences, who are dealing with new language, new English speakers, to be able to take something that's a little more complicated and change the reading level of the information they're trying to communicate is also very helpful.
Did the participation of your AI work group get to engage during work time by, oh, sorry, let me try that again. Did
Sure.
the participants of your AI work group get to engage during work time bi-weekly?
Yeah, that was all done on work time. That wasn't like, hey, we have a new training that you do unpaid. That'd be very well received.
Okay, I have one more.
Sure.
Zoom and I had arguments today. How do
Uh-oh.
you feel? How do you feel about books that do not reveal if any part of it was created / verified, et cetera, by AI, or the idea of AI free, quote, certified, unquote, content, proverbial inaccurate ostrich in sand? Thank you for all of this.
I'm not sure I totally understand. There was an issue in terms of disclosure of using AI
Okay, I said-
within
I
a
think it's-
presentation, or?
How do you, okay, well, Zoom and I
No,
had
it's okay.
arguments. Okay, how do you feel about books that do or do not reveal that part of it was
Oh,
created
the
or
books.
verified by AI?
Yeah,
Or-
I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Go ahead.
So I think transparency is one of those important things. When I talk about, I've recently written about, generative AI books in the library. And what do we do about that, for example? And from a starting point, I don't know what is the argument against transparency. I don't understand what the argument is against transparency, especially this early on in a relationship. So I think we should take pains to indicate when generative AI is used in these things. From an acquisition standpoint, whether you add a book or not, is a quality assurance matter. But certainly, I think you owe it to everybody to know, was that human authored or not?
Okay, those are all of the online questions. Last chance for in-person questions. Okay, I will hand it. You have a little closing spiel.
Okay.
No, just give us a few minutes. The last bit of that the last bit of that last question was a thing about AI free books, like books free of AI.
In terms of what the feeling is about them, or?
Yeah, the idea of AI free books.
Yeah, well, I think people make value-driven decisions, right? And transparency is important in those. Think about the foods we eat, right? Whether you're buying those cruelty-free eggs or not. We tend to vote with our money. We tend to make purchases that align with our values. And having more information at your fingertips, I think, is important. I believe at the end of there was a movie just came out, Weapons. I don't know if anybody saw it. I'm dying to see it. I heard great things about it. But I think at the end of the movie, they just made a point of saying generative AI was not used in the making of this film, which, is, I think, meaningful to some people. So I would always like to know, was generative AI used and to what extent, or wasn't it? Because it just empowers the end user to make a decision that aligns with their values. We have a really complicated questions that are coming up too about like, what does it mean to be authentic in the age of AI? What does authenticity mean? And as we dabble with generative AI and we use it not to wholly write something, but what is the breaking point? What does human authorship mean? These are important questions.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Nick, for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody for attending this session. Please complete the post-session survey at bit.ly/NWILL session 25. The link is also in the session description. The annual planning committee and our presenters appreciate your feedback. If you want to continue the conversation, you can use the chat within the session or the Hoover community section. And
Lunch
lunch will be served in room 112, which is across the